Something is not adding up in Suzuka. Mercedes didn't bring upgrades. McLaren didn't bring upgrades. And yet, they dominated everything. First session, Mercedes on top. Second session, Piastri goes even faster. Both teams completely ahead of the field. That's not normal. Not under a brand new regulation. Not this early in the season. And here's where it gets serious. Because the FIA is now watching both teams closely. It started with a strange front wing behavior. A movement that didn't look legal. A double activation. 2 phases. Something that should not exist under the rules. Mercedes says it's a malfunction. The FIA says, maybe. But other teams? They're not convinced. And now McLaren is part of the same conversation. Because suddenly, they're just as fast. Just as stable. Just as dominant. And that raises one dangerous question. Is this just performance? Or are we looking at something the FIA didn't intend? Because if this system is real, if it's legal, then Mercedes and McLaren are untouchable. But if it's not, this weekend could explode. So before we break this down, subscribe to the channel. Because what the FIA is investigating right now could change the entire championship. Suzuka doesn't allow illusions. It exposes reality. And on this first day, the reality was clear. Mercedes and McLaren are operating on a completely different level. Not slightly ahead. Not marginally better. A different level. In the first session, Mercedes controlled everything. Russell sets the pace. Antonelli right behind him. No drama. No corrections. No visible limits. Just clean, efficient speed. And that alone was already enough to raise eyebrows. Because they didn't bring upgrades. Nothing new. Nothing visible. And yet, they looked untouchable. But then came the second session. And this is where things changed. Because McLaren didn't just match Mercedes. They went further. Piastri sets the fastest lap of the entire day. Faster than both Mercedes drivers. And not by accident. This wasn't a messy lap. It was precise. Controlled through the S-curves. Stable in high speed. Confident on entry. Almost too perfect. And right behind him, Antonelli. Then Russell. All within a very small margin. That tells you something critical. These two teams are not just fast. They are consistently fast. And consistency is what worries the paddock. Because one fast lap can happen. Conditions. Track evolution. Timing. But repeated performance. From 2 different teams. With no major upgrades. Under a new regulation. That's where questions begin. And here's the detail most people missed. Neither Mercedes nor McLaren looked like they were pushing the absolute limit. No oversteer moments. No aggressive corrections. No visible struggle. The cars looked comfortable. And in Formula 1, when a car looks comfortable at Suzuka, it usually means one thing. There's more performance available. And that's exactly what triggered the suspicion. Because if this is not the maximum, then what happens when they actually push? Now combine that with what we already saw in China. The front wing behavior. That unusual movement. That double-step activation. A detail small enough to ignore, but significant enough to question. And suddenly, everything connects. Because now the dominance in Suzuka doesn't look isolated. It looks like a continuation. Like a pattern. And patterns are what the FIA pays attention to. So while the timing screens show dominance, the paddock sees something else. A potential advantage. Subtle. Difficult to prove. But impossible to ignore. And this is where tension starts to build. Because other teams are watching. Engineers are analyzing. Comparisons are being made. Telemetry. Onboards. High-speed footage. Everyone is looking for the same thing. That one detail. That one clue. That explains why these two cars look so different from the rest. And the most uncomfortable part? No one has a clear answer yet. Because if it's legal, then Mercedes and McLaren have simply outdeveloped everyone. But if it's not, then this isn't just dominance. It's something much bigger. And that's why this story is only just beginning. Because what we saw on track today wasn't just performance. It was a signal. And the real meaning of that signal hasn't been revealed yet. But here's where things take a different turn. Because the suspicion is not really about speed. It's about how that speed is being produced. And this is where the FIA starts looking deeper. Not at lap times. At behavior. Because when engineers analyze these cars, they don't just see fast laps. They see patterns. They see transitions. They see how the car moves between states. And that's exactly where the Mercedes story becomes critical. That front wing behavior from China, it wasn't just a visual detail. It was a clue. A clue about how the car manages airflow, And more importantly, how it switches between configurations. Because under the new regulations, that transition is everything. Straight line mode, cornering mode, 2 states, nothing in between. But what if there is something in between? What if the system doesn't just switch, but adapts, even for a fraction of a second? That tiny window could be worth tenths, not visible on the surface, but massive over a lap. And that's exactly what raised concerns. Because when that front wing appeared to move in 2 phases, it suggested something unusual. Not necessarily illegal, but not completely understood either. And now, bring McLaren into this. Because suddenly, their car shows similar strengths. High-speed stability, smooth transitions, confidence in direction changes, especially through sectors where other teams struggle. And that's not random, because both teams share something fundamental. Philosophy, not identical designs, but similar thinking. Efficient energy deployment, clean aerodynamic transitions, minimal loss between modes. And in this regulation, that's everything. Because the biggest limitation right now is not power. It's how you manage it, how you deploy it, how you recover it, and most importantly, how you avoid losing it at the wrong moment. That's where the term comes in. Super clipping. That sudden drop in power. That invisible wall drivers hit on the straights. Most teams suffer from it. Some more than others. But Mercedes? They've minimized it. Almost eliminated it compared to the rest. And McLaren, after their issues in China, suddenly looks much closer to that level. That's not coincidence. That's engineering. And now everything starts to align. Front wing behavior, energy efficiency, smooth transitions, consistent lap times. Individually, none of these prove anything. But together, they create a picture that the FIA cannot ignore. Because this is how advantages appear in Formula One. Not as one big breakthrough, but as multiple small gains that combine into something much bigger. Something difficult to detect, but impossible to match. And that's exactly why the investigation matters. Not because something is clearly illegal, but because something is clearly different. And when something is different in Formula One, it either becomes the future of the sport, or it gets shut down. There is no middle ground. So now the tension increases. Because every lap from Mercedes and McLaren is no longer just performance. It's evidence. Every onboard, every sector time, every comparison is being studied. Quietly, carefully. And the teams know it. They feel it. They understand that right now, they are not just leading the field. They are being watched. And that changes everything. Because once scrutiny begins, there are only 2 possible outcomes. Either the advantage is confirmed as legal, and everyone else has to catch up. Or, something gets questioned. Something gets limited. Something gets removed. And if that happens, the entire competitive order could change overnight. Which means, what we saw today in Suzuka might not be the true picture of this weekend. It might just be the beginning of a much bigger story. And this is where the real pressure begins. Not on track. Off track. Because once the FIA starts paying attention, teams start reacting. Quietly at first, then aggressively. Because no one wants to be left behind. And no one wants to be on the wrong side of the rules. So what happens next is always the same. Engineers from rival teams start digging deeper. Not just watching lap times. Watching details. Micro details. How the front wing flexes under load. How quickly it transitions at the end of the straight. How stable the car remains when switching modes. And most importantly, what happens in that tiny moment between states. Because that's where the advantage lives. And that's where everyone is now looking. But here's the problem. If this advantage exists, it's extremely difficult to prove. Because it doesn't show as something obvious. It doesn't look like a loophole. It looks like perfection. And perfection is hard to question. That's why the FIA doesn't react immediately. They observe. They compare data. They cross-check telemetry. They look for inconsistencies. And they do it quietly. Because the moment they act publicly, everything changes. Now here's where the tension really builds. Because teams like Ferrari, Red Bull, and others, they are not waiting. They are already asking questions. Not publicly. Internally. Technically. They want clarity. Because if Mercedes and McLaren have found something within the rules, then everyone needs to understand it. Fast. But if they found something at the edge of the rules, then that edge needs to be defined. Immediately. And this creates a very specific kind of pressure. Not the pressure of racing. The pressure of interpretation. Where the rulebook is the same for everyone. But the understanding of it is not. And this is where Formula One becomes political. Because now it's not just about performance. It's about influence. About how teams present their case. About how convincing their explanations are. About how the FIA interprets intent versus effect. And this is exactly the situation we are entering right now. Because Mercedes already gave their explanation. Hydraulic issue. Unintentional behavior. No advantage. And officially, that's accepted. But unofficially, doubts remain. And McLaren? They haven't been accused of anything. Not directly. But their performance has placed them in the same spotlight. And that's enough. Because in Formula One, you don't need to be accused to be investigated. You just need to be different. And right now, these two teams are very different. So now we arrive at the most important point. Timing. Because all of this is happening right before qualifying. Right before the moment where everything matters. And that changes the stakes completely. Because if the FIA decides to look deeper, even slightly, teams might be forced to adjust. Small changes. Subtle tweaks. Nothing dramatic. But enough to affect performance. And if that happens, the order we saw today could shift suddenly, without warning. Because in Formula One, the biggest changes don't always come from upgrades. Sometimes, they come from clarification. So now the entire grid is waiting. Not just for lap times, but for signals. For any indication that something is about to change. Because if Mercedes and McLaren keep their advantage, then this becomes a two-team fight. Clear, defined, difficult to stop. But if something gets questioned, if something gets limited, if something gets adjusted, then everything opens up again. And that's why this story is so important. Because we are not just watching a dominant performance. We are watching a situation that could evolve in real time, during the weekend. And that almost never happens. So now, the focus shifts from what we saw to what we might see next. Because the real impact of this investigation hasn't happened yet. And when it does, it won't just affect Mercedes. It won't just affect McLaren. It will affect everyone. And the only question left is, when?